Alrighty, this is the March Q&A Live. We do these every month for permaculturists, for farmers, for homesteaders, for gardeners, backyard food foresters, you name it. So we're going live on YouTube and also on TikTok Live. So if you are following on the TikTok Live, you're welcome to add some questions into the queue, and then we'll write those down. Any of the questions that are asked during the live, we will do at the very end of the broadcast. All of the questions that we do in this live are fueled by our Patreon community. So if you are here from Patreon, again, I want to thank you so much for your monthly support, for allowing us to be able to do content like this to help equip people. If you are not familiar with our Patreon community, you can go to patreon.com/permaculturefx. And depending on what your subscription is, we do classes, PDF documents, farm tours, Q&A community to really help people on that journey, more than just the typical YouTube format, but really allowing people to dialogue and ask questions in a way that has a good knowledge base. I found for me personally, I used to jump in the Facebook groups, and what I found honestly is the feedback was so bad and just, people are very well intended, but don't always have experience or a knowledge base for a particular growing zone or a particular plant. And what really started to get me is watching some of the advice in, Facebook or social media groups that could actually be damaging to a human. Yeah, go ahead and eat that plant. Actually, no, that is not a plant you want to eat. Or identifying a plant incorrectly, could have real health damaging things that could follow, or giving a plant to an animal that maybe they should have in very small doses. So I think providing that safe place in the Patreon community has been very beneficial. So this month we want to jump in. What I always try and do first is give you the top things that I would be doing in the garden right now during this month and this in certain growing seasons or growing zones. So I want to jump into those first, and then we've got, I think, 12 questions from the Patreon community. I'm going to read you the questions, and then we'll kind of talk about some of those answers first. And then we'll do any questions that show up in the queue at the very end before we're finished with the broadcast. So before I jump into the different growing zones and what I would be doing right now in the garden in those growing zones, I do want to preface that every growing zone is not the same. For example, Zone 9A in Central Florida, there are going to be nuances that are different in Zone 9A in California. Now, the broad brushstrokes are going to be very similar or the same. But just because you are Zone 9 doesn't mean everything that I say to the T is going to be applicable for you and your particular microclimate. So even Zone 9A here in Central Florida, if I go 5 miles down the road, there are certain things that could be very different for them just down the road. So for example, I have higher elevation on my particular site. So what that higher elevation does is we don't get hit with the frost as much as someone that might be down in the valley. And so we're able to kind of press our zone a little bit and try some Zone 9B, some Zone 10A things, whereas other people down in the valley may not be able to do that for their particular site. So when I go through the top 3 things for Zone 3 through 8, keep in mind you should always check with local resources that are around you in your geographical area first before just jumping in and doing something. So 3 things that I would be doing if I lived in USDA zones 3 through 8 right now. The first thing that I would be doing is getting my compost ready. Now, if you're in zones 3 through 5, you're probably not putting compost on your fruit trees, berry bushes, and nut trees just yet. But zones 5 and 6, so for those of you that are in Kansas or Missouri or Tennessee, you've already got spring bulbs coming up, the eastern redbuds are blooming, the dogwood trees are blooming, so you are ready to go to start adding that compost to the soil. So that's the first thing that I would be doing is the compost, primarily because compost is light enough that it's not going to shock your plants into producing a lot of green growth just in case you do have a frost. I remember when I lived in Kansas City probably 6 or 7 years ago, it was like May 5th and we had snow, so you can still get those hard frost or hard freezes later on, in the growing season. So compost very lightly, and then you're going to add that full bore, usually around May 1st is the general safe time. Second thing that I would be doing in USDA zones 3 through 8 right now in the garden would be the last call on fruit tree pruning. Now, if those buds have swollen and opened up, I'm probably going to wait until the tree is dormant to do that pruning again. But if your fruit trees, berry bushes, nut trees are still dormant, the buds have not opened up, there's no flowers being produced, you are still okay to go ahead and do that pruning. So I know a lot of places, like my family is up in mid-Michigan, you're still able in mid-Michigan, in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Vermont, you can still be pruning those fruit trees and berry bushes right now without batting an eye at all, because the sap is not flowing yet. And that's really the general rule of thumb is, people ask a lot, when should I prune the fruit trees? Whenever it is the most dormant, when you have the least amount of sap that's flowing, that's when you want to prune the trees, because that lessens your chance of getting a fungal or a bacterial infection in the tree. So the third thing that I would be doing right now in USDA zones 3 through 8 would be dormant planting. Now I know the fun thing to do on Mother's Day is to take mom plant shopping, and it's so tempting to buy those fruit trees when they're in full flower and they're looking, awesome and lush, but that's one of the worst times to plant the trees, because all of that plant's energy are up top trying to produce lush growth. The energy is not going to the roots, which is actually where you want the energy of that tree to be going when you first put it in the ground. So USDA zones 3 through 8, get those trees in the ground right now. This is a great time to be doing it. So you could be doing peach, you could be doing plums, apples, pears, gooseberries, currants, elderberries, raspberries, blackberries, all of those things in USDA zones 3 through 8. Persimmon, another great thing to be putting in the ground right now in that USDA growing zone range. So again, if you're in USDA growing zones 3 through 8, composting, last call on pruning, and then dormant planting of your fruit trees. So those are the 3 things that you should be focusing on. Personally, I did live for most of my life in those colder climate zones, but I've been here in Central Florida for a hot minute. So I'm in USDA zone 9B. So if you are in zones 9 through 11, here's what we're doing right now. First, number 1 is blood meal, blood meal, blood meal. So blood meal is very, very high in nitrogen. So that's going to give you that good green push of new growth this time of year. And it's going to be a slow release over a couple months. So when you apply that blood meal, we'll get into this a little more later, just look at the application rate. How many tablespoons or a half a cup per tree, depending on the species, how you have it planted, whether it's in the ground or in the pot. Never give bone meal or blood meal more than the recommended amount, because you can risk burning the leaves of the tree. So just be aware of that. You can also apply right now in zones 9 through 11 Epsom salt. So that's a great source of magnesium sulfate to be exact. And you can do azomite. So azomite is very high in minerals, especially silica. If you're wanting an organic version or a plant-based version of the azomite, I would recommend bamboo leaves. So shredding the bamboo leaves, bamboo is very, very high in silica and also in other minerals. So shredding those or running the bamboo leaves over with a mower is a great way to, add those into your system. The second thing that I'd be doing in USDA zones 9 through 11 is planting our tropical trees, the ones that are more frost sensitive. So think avocados, think mangoes, think Jamaican cherry, Barbados cherry, strawberry tree, cherimoya, atamoya, any of those ones that are a little fussy. Between now and, really May 1st, this is the best window to get those in the ground, because you want them to root in and have the next 8 or 9 months to get a strong root system established before it gets cold. So this is really your ideal time. Now, can you plant avocados, mangoes, strawberry tree, all of those things later in the season, yes, absolutely. Probably up until July, August, or September. However, that's not the best practice. Best practice allows for those trees to really be able to root in very, very well before they go into their dormancy. Third thing that I'd be doing right now in USDA zones 9 through 11 is this is the last kind of time to do your winter chop and drop remains. So things like Mexican sunflower or Napier grass or banana leaves or vetiver or, whatever, any of those that didn't die off over the winter, but you want to trim them up, make them look a little pretty before the growing season starts. Now is your time to do that. It's getting warmer now. Green growth is starting to push. So if you're ready to kind of trim up those banana plants, make them look really nice for the growing season, cut back the vetiver or lemongrass or Napier grass or tiger grass, Mexican sunflower. This is the ideal time to kind of trim those up and make them look real pretty and use that as chop and drop going into the next season. So again, for USDA zones 9 through 11, you're adding blood meal, bone meal, and azomite. Secondly, you are planting your cold sensitive trees, avocados, mangoes, etc. And number 3, you're doing chop and drop with any of the remaining winter biomass accumulators, things like banana leaves, vetiver, Napier grass, or Mexican sunflower. So that's kind of the summary right now. If you're wanting a more detailed list of what should you be doing with animals in the food forest, what should you start from seed, what should you be transplanting, we have a free gardening calendar every month. It's at permaculturefx.com. The link for that is in the bio, and so that is free every month. So there's no crazy gimmicks. You can just go to the website, click on your growing zone, and that will give you some good broad brushstrokes of how to jump into your own property. So I want to jump in now to the Q&A. So every month, the Patreon community sends in their questions of things that are just on their radar for their homesteads. Now, the Patreon community, we have some that live in Norway. We have some that live in Florida, California, Michigan, Missouri. So people are kind of from all over. So these questions are not going to be USDA zone specific, although I will try and mention along the way, what growing zones these questions could be applicable for. Now, if you do have additional questions, you are welcome to paste those in the comments. And if there is time, at the very end, we'll get to any questions that are listed in the comments, but I'm going to answer the Patreon community questions first. Excuse me. So question number 1. So this is more in relation to USDA zones 9 through 11. Is if I'm planting moringa from seed, is it better to do this directly in the ground or in a pot first and transplant? Now, personally, I don't have great luck on most sites growing moringa directly from seed in the ground. It's a lower germination rate. It's harder to keep the moisture consistent without rotting the seeds. Squirrels will end up getting in there, digging the seeds up. So for me, that has not been the most successful practice. I get a much better germination rate starting them and then in pots and putting them in the ground. So what I typically do, strip the seeds out of the moringa pod, take the individual seeds and take off that white papery coating, soak them in water. I add a little bit of probiotics like BioAg overnight. And then the next day I go ahead and I plant them in tiny pots. And then once they get to be 12 inches tall, I put them in the ground, and then I'm G to G. I'm good to go. For me personally, that's been my best germination rate and success, has been putting them in pots first and then transferring them into the ground. So plant whole pod in the ground. Good question. So no, I don't plant the whole pod in the ground. Open up that long pod, take out the individual seeds first, and then put those individual seeds in pots. Question number 2, if I'm growing moringa in a smaller space, what are your thoughts on fertilizing regimen, how to chop them and prune them, etc.? So when you're growing moringa in a smaller space, now moringa you can do in a suburban backyard. Personally, I don't think moringa makes a very pretty tree. I think they get very lanky. In hurricane season, they do tend to break. They blow really, really easily. It's a softer wood. And then honestly, in the winters, they're bare naked and they just look stupid. So personally, I use moringa primarily as a chop and drop. So there's two ways that you can go about this. Either one is called pollarding, where you have one central lead, 3 or 4 feet tall. So imagine my arm is that 3 or 4 foot central lead. And then you have a few branches at the top that you cut off. An example of this is how people often prune a crepe myrtle, which I think looks stupid, but it is functional for moringa. So you get that strong central lead and then you're cutting on the top. Now on that method, it's gonna look visually more appealing because you get that upright, formal upright style. However, you're only gonna be chopping it and dropping it or chopping it and drying it about 3-ish, maybe 4 times a year. The alternative is coppicing. So that was pollarding. Coppicing is where you cut it off 4, 5, 6 inches from the ground. And then in that type of a method, it does look dumber because it's like almost like a bush. However, you can get 4, 5, 6 cuttings per year. So it really depends on what your purpose is in that. Fertilization of moringa, I use a little bit of nitrogen material like blood meal to get it started. After that, nothing. Moringa has a taproot that's gonna go down many, many feet down into the ground, and that's gonna bring up all of those minerals that you really need. So I don't do any fertilizing with moringa after the initial planting. Now, when I plant them initially, I do add some compost around the base, 4 to 6 inches or 6 to 8 inches of wood chips, keeping it away from the trunk of the tree. And then I let it grow and do its thing. After that, moringa is serving me because of its taproot. It's bringing up those minerals, and I'm either using that with cattle, with chickens. I'm drying it and grinding it up myself to add into Himalayan sea salt. Moringa is for us and the food forest. So it's a wonderful plant, very easy to do in small spaces as well. Question number 3, when applying blood meal, how much should I use in various contexts? That is very much one of those famous permaculture questions with the answer of, it depends. It depends on what company of blood meal. And the reason why I say that is some companies are dehydrating and grinding that blood meal up at a much higher concentration rate versus some are diluting it with water and then has a lesser concentration rate. So definitely follow the directions on the back of the package. Do not add more than what is recommended. It's not gonna help your plants, it's only gonna hurt them. So if in doubt, use a little less than what is recommended. Wait for 3 or 4 weeks, see how the plant responds, and then do a secondary application if needed. But definitely with blood meal, bone meal, and feather meal, because they are dehydrated and concentrated ingredients, follow the instructions depending on what company you choose. Question number 4, Napier grass. Should I grow this in rows or in clumps? And I would say the answer to this question is also applicable for tiger grass, vetiver, Mexican sunflower. So this is applicable to many. It's not gonna really matter if you do it in rows or clumps. To be honest, the 3 things that I would consider are number 1, how close is it to the animals that are gonna be grazing on it? So if it's better to do it in a clump in the middle of the pasture, let it hang over, let them eat it to the ground, great. If it's better to do it just outside of their fence to where it's kind of hanging into their pasture to where they're not eating it all the way down, then do it in a line on the edge of the pasture. So how close is it to animals would be number 1. Number 2, how close is it to the fruit trees that you're using it for chop and drop? Beloved, I am lazy. I'm a hard worker, but I don't want to have to go hauling vetiver grass or Mexican sunflower or moringa all the way across my yard. I want to cut it down and throw it on the tree right next to it. So literally, if I'm growing Napier grass or Mexican sunflower, it's either right along the pasture fence line for the animals, or it's 8 or 10 feet away from a fruit tree that I'm chopping it and dropping it right there at the base. So the first thing to consider would be, where are the animals? Second is, where are the fruit trees that those chop and drop plants are going to be serving? The third thing that I would consider is, what's the view? I don't want to plant them right outside of a window in my home that really is going to block my view of my yard, my property, my food forest. Think about the windows in your house as a living picture frame. So when you look out every window in your house, create a vignette. And so maybe you have, two trees that are on the side or a vine that's growing up overhead. Maybe there's something outside of that window in the center, like a statuary piece, a bird bath, bird feeder, or whatever it happens to be that is kind of the center of that piece. But imagine every window in your house as a living picture frame. So I'm considering animals, I'm considering where the trees are, and third is the view. Question number 5, can Napier grass be grazed directly as you would Mexican sunflowers, or can they eat it all the way down to the ground? Really good question. So Napier grass is safe for animals that have rumens. So Napier grass, tiger grass, vetiver, Mexican sunflower are going to be great for cows, horses, donkeys, sheep, goats, llamas, going to be great for all of these. The thing that I would really consider is how big are those animals and what is their rumen able to control? So if I let my Napier grass get to be 17 feet tall, the base of those are going to be really thick and very woody in texture because of the high carbon, and they've started to harden off. Can a sheep or a goat eat that? Yes, but it's very hard on the rumen. So in that scenario, because their rumens are much smaller, I would probably do more of the chop and drop and feed it over to them if the central stem has gotten too hard. Now, I will say, animals are smart. By and large, they are not going to eat something that is going to harm them. However, you always have that one animal that gets real curious. Horses are notorious for this, and they're just like, I'm going to eat this. Why? Because I can. And that's literally the only reason why they eat it. So you've kind of got to know your animals, know your growing scenario. If you are in doubt, ease the animals into it. Because even though Napier grass is really good for those animals with rumens, they haven't had that in their diet necessarily before. So it may take a month, 2 months, 3 months, or 6 months to ease that back into their diet. So that way their rumen has the microbiome to be able to digest it and make it soluble for the body. So that is question number 5. Number 6, we bottle raised an animal. Is there any hesitancy in using that animal for future breeding? I would say the first thing that I would ask is, did they have colostrum when they were born? That colostrum is going to give them the antibodies, the microbiome. That good dose of initial life dramatically impacts the overall health of that animal going forward. If it did not have the colostrum, that could be the fault of the mother. Either one, the mother had mastitis and it wasn't able to feed. Maybe the mother's genetics were not very good and she didn't know to feed her offspring, which does happen. Or maybe the mother passed away. So I think those are all things to really consider. If you have like a mom, for example, that gets mastitis every time she gives birth, I'm probably not going to use that mom for breeding genetics because there could be something wrong that she's predisposed to mastitis. So I don't want 5 other calves with that predisposition to mastitis. So when I'm doing things for breeding, I'm selecting the best of the best. And this is true with animals, with cows, with chickens, with horses. Also true with tomatoes. I'm not going to take the junky looking tomato and save seeds from it. I'm going to save the first fruits, which is also a biblical concept. I'm going to save the first fruits, but I'm also going to save the best looking ones. And I'm going to save seeds from those because they are the most vibrant DNA and genetic stock. So that would be my thought is question 1, did they have good colostrum when they were born? And then number 2, watch their genetics as they're growing up. Now, if that animal struggles, if it's a sheep and it really kind of has failure to thrive. It's not putting on the weight that it should. It's not grazing the way that it should. It tends to get sick more. I'm not going to use it for breeding. I'm going to love that animal, help it live its best life, give it its best opportunity to succeed, but I'm going to save breeding for the best of the genetics because that's what I want to replicate and duplicate in my system. Number 7, how long does chicken poop need to sit before you can use it? So I think the reason for that question is twofold. One is the length of time is going to affect the amount of pathogens and bacteria, the bad bacteria, that could be found in the manure. So for example, if it hasn't sat long enough, there could be E. coli, there could be Salmonella, there could be H. pylori. All of those can be transferred to humans, especially H. pylori. So I think it's really important for us to let it sit long enough, even a little bit longer if we're in doubt. Now, how long does it have to sit? It really is going to depend on your climate. Now, in Florida, sometimes you can get it finished in 4 to 6 weeks. Sometimes it takes 3 months. So the key with this is you want that compost to have at least 5 to 7 days, not business days, but 5 to 7 days where the center of that compost pile is above 135 degrees. Why? Great question. Thanks for asking. 135 degrees is the temperature that it's going to kill off the damaging bacteria and any viral things going on, the Salmonella, E. coli, so that way the good stuff can reproduce in it. So I want to have 5 to 7 days where that compost pile is above 135 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, a chicken manure, you don't want to just let it sit by itself in the bucket because that manure is primarily nitrogen-based. All manure is primarily nitrogen-based. So you want to balance the carbon to nitrogen ratio, the greens and the browns. So the greens would be like grass, vegetable scraps, manure, that sort of thing. The browns are carbon-based. So this is like leaves, dried grass, straw, that sort of thing, wood shavings, sticks. That's going to be our carbon. So when we're composting chicken manure, that's going to be a 7-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio for it to be a healthy balance. So that means for every 1 part, for every 1 bucket that you have of manure, you want 7 parts of carbon. So if you have 1 bucket of manure, you want 7 buckets of dried straw or grass clippings or something like that. Now, some foods or cattle manure or horse manure, that's a 15-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So if you have 1 bucket of horse manure or cow manure, you need 15 buckets of carbon to balance that out to where it composts safely. Can you do it by itself? Yes. But I would let it sit a lot longer and let it get a lot hotter to make sure that those bad pathogens have been addressed. Question number 8. So and this is in regard to Mexican sunflower. Can you feed this to your animals at any time? Is it dangerous to let those animals graze after it's flowered? I think the reason why this question is being asked is because there are some plants like sun hemp, for example, that the chemical constituents in the plant change once it's flowered. So for example, sun hemp. So this one can get to be 9 feet tall within a couple months. Once that flowers, there are certain chemicals in it that can actually really damage the animals, especially in the seed pods. So once it's produced a flower in a seed pod, you don't feed the sun hemp to cattle, to livestock, or to sheep. Mexican sunflower is not one of those. So Mexican sunflower is totally fine to let them enjoy it and eat it at any age. I love Mexican sunflower when it flowers. It's pretty. It's a great pollinator. It's one of the last bloomers of the season. So it's great for those honeybees, the native pollinators, because it's kind of their last hurrah in the season. Now, if you're in USDA zones 3 through 8, your alternative to Mexican sunflower for biomass would probably be Jerusalem artichoke or sunchokes. Some people call them fartichokes because they do make you real gassy. But the Jerusalem artichoke doesn't have the same nitrogen fixing capabilities, but it does produce a great amount of biomass and a very similar flower. So yes, for Mexican sunflower, you can feed that at any time. Doesn't matter if it's flowered or not. Sun hemp, however, that is one that I would definitely feed your animals before it flowers. Question number 9. Does Mexican sunflower have nodules on the roots like most of the Fabaceae family, beans, peas, or legumes? No. So generally speaking, most of the species that are going to fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil are going to be in that Fabiaceae family, so beans, peas, and legumes. So the way that those work is the nodules on the roots are basically, think of it like an Uber driver for a rhizobia microbe, and the byproduct of that root nodule, the Uber driver and the rhizobia, the byproduct of that releases nitrogen into the soil. Generally speaking, that has to take place when the plant dies, when it's chopped and dropped. So when you cut it off at the surface, those roots have a natural die-off and they release that nitrogen, kind of like if you were to have a Roth IRA in banking. You don't get to touch it for a long, long time, but then at a certain time, you finally get access to that Roth IRA and it releases the finances with interest. That's really what it does with the nitrogen fixing in most beans, peas, and legumes. Now, there are a few species. Mexican sunflower is one, the daisy tree, Montanoia grandifolia. That's another one that even though it's not a bean, pea, or legume, it still does use the process of nitrification to interact with the rhizobia to release the nitrogen into the soil. The other thing with Mexican sunflower to consider is there's a lot of nitrogen in the green leaves. However, you have to bury the green in order to get the nitrogen in your soil. If you just chop and drop it and leave the green exposed to the elements, that nitrogen is going to be released back into the atmosphere because there's a lot of nitrogen up there in the air. It's going to be released back up. So if you want that nitrogen in your soil and you want to be doing the nitrogen in the ground and sequestering that carbon in the ground, chop it, drop it, and then bury it over with a little bit of dirt, compost, or some wood chips, and then you get that back down into the soil where you want it. Question 10, a lot of Mexican sunflower questions this month. So are Mexican sunflowers alleliopathic? The answer to that is kind of yes. The other side of that question, first of all, what is alleliopathic? Basically, that means that that plant can release a chemical into the soil that inhibits the growth of other species. So for example, in the Midwest, black walnut trees. So there is a chemical it releases into the soil, jungalone, that not a lot of other plants will grow under a black walnut tree, and that's why. Regular sunflowers are the same way. Most of the Helianthus family actually is slightly alleliopathic. That's why underneath bird feeders, if you have a lot of sunflower seeds, you don't see a lot of other things growing under bird feeders because that the chemicals in the shells of the bird seed is going into the soil, preventing the growth of other plants. Mexican sunflower is similar. Now remember, the alleliopathic impact is not going to be on 8, 10, 12 feet. It's really going to be kind of right around the base. I'm talking inches or a few feet, not like 3 feet or 2 or 3 yards. So yes, they are kind of alleliopathic. So you're not going to get a lot of stuff growing right underneath of the Mexican sunflower. But why do I need stuff to grow under there? There's other places that I can put my plants anyway. So I would say the benefit far outweighs the drawback of it being alleliopathic. Next question. Number 12 is in relation to contractor paper. So I had somebody that took a picture. They had contractor paper down around a plant. I think it was a jujube. They sprayed it with their hose and noticed that the contractor paper was repelling the water. Yes, that totally can happen. However, so don't assume that because that contractor paper pushed the water off, that means that your plant is not going to get water. So what's going to end up happening, and I'll show you some contractor paper here that David's bringing in. Contractor paper I use literally in every single fruit tree installation. It's literally like 140 to 170 feet, depending on where you buy it per roll. It's like 14 to 17 bucks, depending on where you buy it. And I literally roll this out 2 layers thick, and that's my weed suppressant for a new food forest or a fruit tree. So the reason why I like that contractor paper is multi-tiered. I used to use Amazon boxes. Problem with that, number one, is I hate taking off tape and staples. Number two, there's a lot of glue and dye inside cardboard, and all of that glue and dye is going to leach inside your soil. Number three, I already told you I'm a lazy gardener. When you overlap those boxes, like the slits that are in the Amazon boxes, weeds have a spiritual gift to find those little cracks where you didn't overlap it really well. The weeds are going to grow up in there. So I have stopped using boxes for that reason. I like the contractor paper because it's 3 feet wide, which is a really good width for a fruit tree row if you're doing agroforestry. So really, really good for an installation, 2 layers thick. It lasts just long enough to kill off the weeds, and then it's already decomposed. So I really like that aspect. There's not a lot of glue. There's no dyes. So that's why I really like it. Now, when you do the contractor paper down, typically what I recommend is do a little bit of compost on top of that, or grass clippings or whatever, and then do 6 to 8 inches of wood chips on top of that. What that's gonna do is that's gonna not only further suppress the weeds, it's gonna slowly break down and compost in place and give you the nutrients you need for that agroforestry row or the garden space, because you can use this in a veggie garden as well. And then honestly, when you start getting weeds, cut a little bit more contractor paper, set it down on top of the weeds, and then cover it with more wood chips. And that's typically my process for that maintenance. Now, what you noticed with it repelling the water, that's not gonna happen once you get your compost and your wood chips on top, because it's gonna keep that continually moist. So that's only gonna take place when you first lay that paper down and you spray it with water. Yeah, the water has to saturate first before it's gonna be released down into the soil. If you're really worried about it, the alternative is either one, take a pitchfork and poke a couple holes in it, which isn't really necessary. 2, you can take a spray bottle of soapy water, and that will break the water tension and allow it to soak down into your soil. But honestly, you don't really need to. Put down the contractor paper, 2 inches of compost or grass clippings or straw, 6 to 8 inches of wood chips, water it thoroughly, and then you are pretty good to go. So the next question here, and I believe this is our last one. We got a couple from the feed. This one is on Patreon. So as I understand it and still learning, permaculture encourages avoiding monocultures as a means to limit pests and diseases. Traditional farming and vegetable growing encourages crop rotation. So does planting polycultures alleviate the need for crop rotations, or does it just require more careful planning in the layouts and the rotations? You are correct, it depends. So some of the benefit of rotating crops, one is it's very helpful if you're in a small space. So you don't tax a small space like a raised bed for too many nutrients at once. So for example, if you do tomatoes in the same bed every single year for 3 to 5 years, not only do those tomatoes need all of the same nutrients and you are pulling all of that out of the soil every year, but also the same pests, tomato hornworms or aphids, that can overwinter in that space, but also some things like blight, early or late blight, that can overwinter in the soil. So not only are you, when you interplant doing polyculture or you do crop rotations, is it good for the soil so you're not taxing it too much? It's good because you have diversity in the insects, both good pollinators and keeping the bad ones confused, but it also creates enough diversity that things like blight are not going to affect the same crops, year after year after year. So it kind of does depend. Polycultures are going to help, but even if it's a polyculture, so for example, if you did a tomato polyculture, if I'm doing a tomato guild, some of the ones I really like are tomato as one plant, carrots because it is a deep taproot that helps aerate the soil a little bit. I like the flowers of the carrots even because it's a great pollinator. I typically like to do some type of a highly scented herb or a lettuce around the base because a lot of the bad insects like aphids don't love a lot of the deep leafy greens or the highly scented herbs. So if I'm doing that as a guild, that does help. It is going to confuse the insects a little bit. There are slightly different nutrients that are being used. However, if I do that same polyculture guild every single time, it is still going to tax the soil over time. So I like at least always using a polyculture, and when possible, do crop rotation. If you cannot do crop rotations, honestly, every 7 years, give the space a rest. If you've got a garden, every 7 years, give the garden a rest, give the soil a rest, give yourself a rest. Throw some beans, peas, or legumes down and walk away. Let it grow all summer long and just let it rest. So, couple questions here. So, just went to a biochar workshop. How much biochar for a new agroforestry row? So generally speaking, I do about a half a gallon to 1 gallon of biochar around the base of every fruit tree, if you're leaving it in chunks. The key with biochar is surface area. So science tells us, math tells us that those big chunks, there's only so much surface area available for those microbes initially. If you want to maximize that surface area, grind it up into a powder, and then that will spread 10 times the distance. So you might get 10 fruit trees in with the biochar powder versus 1 fruit tree with the chunks of biochar. So that would be kind of thought number 1. So how much for a 30 or 40 foot agro row? That depends on, are you using the chunks or are you using the powder of it? And you'll always get more bang for your buck if you inoculate that biochar before adding it to your soil. So that's a huge thing. The other thing I will say, this is mildly controversial, but it's just real. A lot of times when we buy biochar, we are buying really overrated charcoal. The way that you tell the difference, Geoff Lawton has a really good video on this. Geoff Lawton is one of the father figures in permaculture. And I can get into the science of this. We could look at it sometime under a microscope if you want. So basically what biochar is you take something that you're burning and you cut off all of the oxygen, and here's the key, you let it continue burning and smoldering without the oxygen. And what that does is it burns out all of the oils. So think about it like this. If you were to take a sponge, soak it in olive oil, all of those holes and pores are still full of oil. So you're not adding in nutrients into that because the pores are still full. So what biochar, the gift that it gives, is that's like not only rinsing out that sponge, getting all the oil out, also letting it dry, and then soaking it in probiotics. And then when you let that sponge go, it is loaded with all of the stuff that you've added in. That is real biochar. So charcoal is basically the black stuff. You've burned it in a process, but it still has the oil content. And so if the oil content is still there, that charcoal is not going to become a host or a housing unit for all the things that you're adding because there's no room at the end, so to speak. So the way that you tell, if you take a piece of biochar or charcoal and draw on your hand, it's going to leave a black mark. If you run that under water and kind of rub it off and it washes off fairly easily, that is biochar. There's no oil. So if it's charcoal, you're going to write it on your skin, hold it under water, rub it, and it's going to stay on your skin because it still has oils. The oils in that biochar are leaching to the oils on your skin, and it's not wanting to let go, so you've got to use soap as an emulsifier and scrub it off. So when you buy your biochar, even if it's from someone that you know, love, and trust, still check and see, is this biochar or is this charcoal? Now, all that to say, I would still probably use it even if it was kind of more on the charcoal end because it's better than nothing. And over time, the oils are going to release and it is going to be good. However, the real danger is one, not only are you not housing all of those microbes that you want, the danger is charcoal will massively affect the pH of your soil. That is a big deal, as in it can kill plants because that charcoal, charcoal, it's extremely, extremely far in that direction. So you want to make sure that you're not swinging your whole soil pH out of balance. So that's my biochar rant. So next one, I have chickens, cows, etc. What order do I graze them? So I like to start with bigger animals, specifically those with ruminants, going on down. So if you have cows and horses, I like to do them first. Now, first reason is they're going to be eating mostly the grasses. They are grazers. So they're eating the grasses, things lower to the ground, or soft stemmed greens that are easily digestible. They have more soluble fibers that are in them. So the reason why I like that, one, is it kind of opens up the space, makes it a little bit more light and airy. Two, the compost is very, very rich, very, very much full of nitrogen, ammonia, which also takes longer to compost in place. But here's the other reason, because as soon as those animals poop, the cows, the horses, the donkeys. By the way, if you want a donkey, I got donkeys. I'll give you a donkey. True story. I have like 29 that we need to get rid of, and I will shamelessly give that plug here. So the bigger animals go through first. The reason also why I love them to go through first is because the flies are going to be attracted to that poop. And it's going to take a couple weeks for those flies to lay eggs, which is going to be chicken feed later on. So I do the big animals first. Next, I want to send in my mid-level species, sheep, goats, those smaller animals, because they're not really grazers, they're more foragers. So they're going to eat more sticks, more stems, the harder stalks. Their poop is going to be smaller, but the flies aren't going to be quite as attracted to it very much. So that's why I'm doing that. The reason why I don't want to send goats and sheep in first is because if they're pooping, guess where the cows are eating? They're eating the grass that's on the ground, which means they could be getting remnants of the goat poop in their mouth, which could cause worms or other, bacterial type infections as well. So I want to send the cows through first, not only because of the benefit of the manure, but also I don't want a bunch of other poop on the ground yet that the cows could have the potential to get in their mouth. Then I'm sending in my smaller animals with ruminants because they're going to be my foragers. Lastly, I'm sending in my chickens and my ducks because they're eating bugs, they're eating insects, they're scratching apart the manure, which honestly, I don't want to have to drag every single field all the time. Let the chickens drag it for you. They're going to get in that manure, kick it apart, eat the little maggots, eat the flies, eat the worms, eat the bugs, which is also fly control for your horses and for your cattle. So it's serving multiple purposes on that level. Next one here, I'm starting a food forest and want to take it slow. What should I plant this time of year? I would say if you're wanting to take it slow, I would get your nitrogen fixers and soil builders in first, and then follow that with your longest term fruit trees that take the most amount of time. So for example, if you're in the Midwest and you're doing nitrogen fixers, this time of year, I'd be doing winter pea, I'd be doing cow pea, I'd be doing snow pea, all of those kind of things. Hairy vetch, crown vetch are good to get in the ground by seed. You could also do white or Durana clover or crimson clover right now as a frost seeding. They're not going to germinate for a few months, but it is a good way to frost seed. And then I would go ahead and get your longer term trees in the ground. So zones 3 through 8, these would be like hickory nut, pig nut hickory, black walnut, chestnut, things that are going to take a lot longer to produce. Now in USDA zones 9 through 11, any of the nitrogen fixing plants would be great. Mexican sunflower, daisy tree, winter cassia, Christmas cassia, any of those guys in first because I want to focus on soil, and then my longer term trees. So down here it would be things like pecan, Dunstan chestnut, what's the other? Macadamia nut takes a while, or avocados, especially if you're doing avocados from seeds. Those are going to take 8 or so years to really get producing. So I would get those in first. Focus on soil, number 1, followed by your top story long-term trees. So I believe that is all of the questions that we've got for this month. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to tune in, whether it was to the live or you're watching this on YouTube afterwards. Again, if I talked way too fast for you, all of this is going to be in writing as well. You can go to permaculturefx.com. We do a free monthly gardening calendar there with what to do with animals, livestock, annual vegetable garden, transplanting, food forest, Around the House, Lions and Tigers and Bears Oh My. So that is a free resource that we put out every month. If you're looking for more of a mentorship thing where we're interacting on the daily and weekly basis, where you want some more individualized classes where you can go at your own pace, I would recommend checking out our Patreon, Permaculture FX. Just look that up on Patreon, the letter F, the letter X. And we do a lot of great stuff there, have some incredible community members there that are always asking some beautiful questions and having a great dialogue. So whether you are in USDA Zone 3 up there in Canada, and so hello to you from Vancouver that are listening, or those of you that I know are probably watching in Norway, or you are down here in Central Florida enjoying the 75 degrees and sunshine outside today. Thank you again for giving of your time and for supporting the content. Feel free to like, share, subscribe, do all of the things. And also make sure that you check out Ad Astra Gardens. They're on YouTube. He's got a lot of great local food forest information for those of you that are in USDA zones 9 through 11. So again, thank you so much. As always, have fun.